If, like me, you don't really have much of a social life and you spend too much time on Twitter, you'd be forgiven for thinking that our society has become hopelessly divided, a place where insults and bad faith have replaced the art of debate and conversation. So this show is an attempt to prove this theory wrong. I want to talk to people who don't self-censor, who think it's better to be honest about what they believe, even if it's unpopular, and who don't demonise those who disagree with them. It's a pretty radical concept these days. And when it comes to the culture war, it can get pretty ugly out there. So I want to see if it's still possible for adults to discuss their differences robustly but politely, without calling each other fascists or throwing milkshakes. It's about getting the adults back in the room, basically. Every week, I'll have a panel which will mostly comprise of comedians. Why? Because historically, clowns have always told the truth. The court jester can hold the king to account without losing his head. So I thought it would be interesting to hear what they've got to say. Also, they're a lot cheaper. One of the strangest things about the time in which we live is that people like me, who believe in liberal values, who raise concerns about potential threats to free speech, are often dismissed as reactionaries, or as people who think that racism and sexism are somehow okay. I've even been called a homophobe, which is simply not true. Most of my ex-boyfriends have been gay. The truth is, I'm just very interested in the culture wars, not as a participant, but as a critic. But what exactly is a culture war? I mean, it sounds like a fist fight between Melvin Bragg and Mary Beard. And a recent poll revealed that about 80% of us don't actually know what a culture war is. But there's one going on right now. And it's affecting all of us, whether we like it or not. We've been pulled in, like Al Pacino in Godfather 3, totally against our will. But who's fighting this war? Well, there's a handy trick. If you want to spot the main antagonists, the most active culture warriors are those who tend to say that the culture war is a myth. Or if anyone criticises them, they'll accuse their critics of being the ones who are concocting the culture war. It's cunning, isn't it? And in truth, none of this is about left-wing or right-wing. It's come about because of the rise of a new identity-obsessed social justice movement, which achieves anything but social justice, and is fundamentally opposed to liberal values such as freedom of expression and open debate. It's a kind of secular religion, which now has overwhelming influence in our major cultural, educational and political institutions. It dominates the arts, it dominates the media, and although you may not understand why all of this has happened, that's something I'm struggling to understand myself, you will have seen the evidence of what I'm saying. For instance, most of us will know someone who has been disciplined at work for an unpopular opinion or a misconstrued joke. While the cliche of "you can't say anything anymore" is obviously not true, we're all just that little bit more careful about what we say around our friends or in the workplace. In some ways, that's a good thing. I mean, it means we're being more polite to each other. And we've reached a point where those who are openly racist, sexist or homophobic will become pariahs. Nothing wrong with that. But we've somehow got ourselves into a situation where decent people who feel no prejudice towards others are nonetheless punished, shamed, can have their livelihoods destroyed simply because someone doesn't agree with them. We call this cancel culture, which is as useful a metaphor as any to encapsulate this febrile climate. Now, thanks to cancel culture, you can get your revenge on your ideological opponents, bully them into submission, harass them, threaten them, libel them, insult them, get them fired, trash their reputation, damage their mental health, and you can do all of this while claiming to be the good guy. It's quite a system. Quite apart from cancel culture, there have been other changes too since the social justice ideology went mainstream. Just little things here and there. And taken individually, these incidents seem trivial, something to laugh at, but not worth getting upset about. But taken together, they reveal a general regressive shift, actuated by those who use the language of progress. It's why mainstream broadcasters keep deleting scenes from old comedy shows that they've decided might upset you. It's why writers and artists from the past are being denounced for attitudes that we no longer approve of, but were common in their lifetime. It's why the police are routinely investigating citizens for non-crime. It's why every day we're seeing bizarre headlines in the media, such as "law student facing disciplinary action because she said women have vaginas," and "can my children be friends with white people?" And it's all happened rather quickly, hasn't it? If you'd have shown these headlines to anyone just 10 years ago, they would have thought it was a joke, or perhaps excerpts from some novel set in some weird dystopian future. Why would anyone want to segregate children by race? Why would someone be investigated for stating biological facts? And why would anyone consider this progress? And yet, here we are. It's really tempting to just ignore this kind of nonsense and hope it'll just go away. But if the last 5 years have taught us anything, it's that this is not going anywhere. And the more we try to ignore it, the worse it gets. We've got to discuss these issues. We've got to restate the case for social liberalism and for free speech, because if we don't, these problems are just going to escalate. And I'm not trying to be alarmist. I don't think we're hurtling towards a future of gulags anytime soon. But it does ring a few alarm bells when a young woman who fled from North Korea and is now a student at Columbia University is saying that she sees a lot of similarities between her homeland and the American education system. In an interview this week, Yeonmi Park said that she had expected, on arriving at an American campus, to be interacting with open-minded academics and intellectually curious students, but instead was being, and I quote, forced to think the way they want you to think. North Korea was pretty crazy, she said, but not this crazy. I'm not convinced that things are that bad, but when someone from North Korea thinks you've got a problem with growing authoritarianism, you should probably pay attention. But look, if all this is starting to sound a bit earnest, let me reassure you, for all the disturbing examples of cancel culture and the threats to free speech we'll be covering on this show, we're also going to be looking at the more frivolous stories. And however intimidating culture warriors might be, sometimes they're just plain silly. Like the Washington Post article that went viral this week, which argued that we need to change the names of birds because they might have racist connotations. This is just one example of this new mania to purge the past of all unpalatable aspects, a kind of revisionism that we've all grown accustomed to. And it's such a disappointment to find out that birds are racist. I always thought as a species they were quite fond of migration. Turns out they're just a bunch of feathery Enoch Powells. But it's not just birds, of course. I mean, recently there have been articles in the mainstream media assuring us that soap dispensers are racist too. So are the Muppets, the British countryside, fonts, swimming, mathematics, and even Bernie Sanders' mittens. It can all get quite confusing. And not even Middle-earth can escape the impact of the culture wars. If you think you're going to sit down and read The Hobbit as a light form of escapism, forget about it. The Tolkien Society has a summer seminar coming up in a fortnight, and some of the lectures, they just sound incredible. We've got Gondor in Transition, a brief introduction to transgender realities in Lord of the Rings. The Invisible Other, Tolkien's dwarf women and the feminine lack. And my favourite, destabilising cis-hetero aminonormativity in the works of Tolkien. And if you don't know what that means, don't worry, neither do they. So, Pride Month. For a full 30 days, avaricious corporations who continue to exploit poverty-stricken people in the developing world have been decorating their stores and products with rainbow flags to prove how compassionate they all are. So at least for the next 11 months, they won't have to keep up the pretense, because it must be exhausting. One of the oddities of this culture war is that sex and sexuality should be one of the major battlegrounds. And it's not just corporations who are getting on board. Last week we had the National Trust asking its staff to dress up in rainbow colours with rainbow ribbons in their hair and rainbow face paints, which has no doubt left their visitors rather baffled, given that most of them are septuagenarians who just want somewhere peaceful to eat their Victoria sponge. The NHS in Scotland has asked staff members to sign a pledge to confirm that they are supportive of LGBT people. Having signed the pledge, staff are given a badge to wear while on duty to show that they've signed it. All of which begs the question, why would anyone assume they weren't supportive of gay rights? Wearing a badge to say that you don't have a problem with gay people is a bit like wearing a badge that says, I am not a serial killer. It's bound to make people suspicious. And what about those who don't want to demonstrate their moral virtue at the behest of others? Remember the woman at the restaurant in Washington, D.C., who was accosted by BLM protesters, screaming in her face to force her to raise her fist in solidarity? And even under this kind of mob pressure, she refused. And the thing is, she was a Black Lives Matter supporter. She'd been on the marches. It wasn't that she didn't support the cause, it's that she didn't want to be told how to express herself. I think we could all do with a bit more of that type of courage. And of course, when it comes to the NHS in Scotland, they've left their employees wide open to accusations of bigotry if they don't wear the badge. For instance, one angry person tweeted that after the NHS Scotland announcement, she said, if they don't badge up, then they are trans-hating TERFs and should be dismissed from the NHS. There is no place for hidden haters that take the taxpayers' money as a wage. We don't pay for hate. It's almost as though insisting that people declare their moral virtue can lead to shame and division. I'm sure there's some precedents in history for this kind of thing. Oh, you don't have a photograph of the Supreme Leader on your mantelpiece. I'm afraid we'll have to assume you're a traitor and feed you to the piranhas. With the proliferation of multiple sexualities and genders, it can get very confusing. And for some reason, they've all got their own flags. So, in addition to heterosexual, homosexual and bisexual, you need to learn the following if you want to be truly progressive. Pansexual. This is someone who is attracted to all gender identities. Somnisexual. This is when you only feel sexual attraction for people in your dreams. Autosexual. That's anyone who can only be aroused by themselves. So that's most columnists for The Guardian. Heteroflexible. This is primarily heterosexual, but willing to participate in same-sex activity on occasion. So any straight man after a few pints of Stella. Parasexual is when you don't feel any sexual attraction at all, but you will engage in intercourse for the purposes of reproduction. So, married people, basically. Repulsexual. That's someone who is capable of sexual attraction, but is repulsed by actual sexual activity. Again, that's married people. Oh, requisexual. This is defined as limited or no attraction or interest due to some form of emotional exhaustion. A lot of these are about married people. This is weird. Allosexual. So this is someone who is capable of experiencing sexual attraction, as in the opposite of asexual is allosexual. Presumably, allosexual is someone who gets aroused by dodgy French accents. And then there's quoisexual, which I'm probably mispronouncing, Q-U-O-I, quoisexual, which is when you don't identify with any labels at all. So you're fiercely independent and labels are just for conformists, but you still need a flag for it. A lot of this sounds a lot more like sexual proclivities, doesn't it, rather than sexual orientation? And those can be infinite. When Alfred Kinsey published his famous reports into human sexual behaviour in the 1940s and 50s, people were shocked at the sheer range of different sexual tastes. And given that no two people have precisely the same tastes, isn't the logical endpoint a situation where everyone has their own flag? That's a lot of fabric. Think of the dry cleaning bills. I mean, I know a guy who can only have an intimate experience if he's listening to an audiobook by Jeffrey Archer. Should he have a flag? I mean, sexual identity politics has always been... Oh, there's the flag right there. Sexual identity politics has always been about groups of people fighting against oppression. So the six-stripe rainbow flag, that was a sign of unity. That was the point of it. The whole point of the Pride Rainbow was that it includes everyone. You can get rid of Jeffrey Archer now, we've got the point. But identity politics of today seem to be very much about creating as much division as possible. So the Pride flag, as it currently stands, looks like this. Ugly, isn't it? I mean, seriously, what kind of respectable gay person doesn't know how to colour coordinate? I say we get rid of all the flags and that we just be who we want to be. Look, if you really need to fly a flag to advertise the fact that you've got a fetish for hairdryers or you only ever copulate in the moonlight to appease the ancient lupine gods, then by all means just go ahead. But the key thing to remember, no one cares. So, Barclays Bank has decided that we all need a lesson in social justice. This week, the bank posted a series of instructional Twitter videos. One tells us about gender identity and how we can all become better allies. Another teaches us how we need to raise awareness about microaggressions. Here's one about the importance of using someone's preferred pronouns.
What do you prefer to go as? When you know someone's pronouns, it's respectful to use them. If you don't know, just ask. It might be a few seconds of discomfort, but it's much better than misgendering someone in the long term. It might not be a big deal to you, but it is to him, her, they, them.
In case anyone's forgotten, Barclays is a bank. A bank. The clue's in the name, Barclays Bank. It's a bank whose assets amount to £1.3 trillion. They're not the resistance, they're the establishment. And perhaps it makes me a sentimental old dyed-in-the-wool lefty, but I find it a little off-putting when the capitalist class starts telling the lower orders how they ought to speak and behave. Here's a message from the official Barclays Twitter account. We believe people should be free to be who they are and love who they love. I'm not sure you do. You believe in producing interest income on customer deposits and using a proportion of that income to provide loans to other customers to generate interest expense. That's because you're a bank, and that's what banks do. So why are you telling people they should be free to be who they are and love who they love? It sounds like you're reading out the lyrics of a Celine Dion B-side. The thing is, people tend to react badly when the capitalist corporate class starts patronising them. Remember when Gillette ran a series of adverts about toxic masculinity? They lost an estimated $8 billion. It turns out that sermonising to your core customer base about how they're all inherently evil and should behave better isn't an effective marketing strategy. Or what about Ben & Jerry's, which has called to dismantle white supremacy, defund the police, and has even berated Home Secretary Priti Patel about the plight of refugees, climate change and torture. All of this from a company whose chief goal is to sell as much New York Super Fudge chunk ice cream as possible. I'm not saying people aren't entitled to their opinions, but when I get a 99 from the Mr Whippy van, I don't expect a lecture about the international arms trade or the ongoing human rights abuses in communist China. So why are Ben & Jerry's any different? Just keep on selling your frozen desserts and stop pretending you're Mahatma Gandhi. Are you woke? Do you even know what the word woke means? Well, don't worry if you don't, you're not alone. A recent YouGov poll found that 23% of us say that we are not woke, while 12% say that we are. 59% of respondents don't understand what the term means at all, and half of this group have never even heard it being used. Of those who claim to understand the definition of woke, only a third describe themselves as such, with more than half rejecting the label. But hang on a minute. Doesn't the dictionary say that all woke means is to be alert to injustice, especially racism? I mean, if that's the case, then surely we're all woke, myself included. If only it were that simple. If that's all the word meant, then YouGov surely would have found that 99% of people call themselves woke. But in truth, the term has been through so many different stages of evolution, it's become a lot more complicated. And whether we like it or not, the word now has ideological connotations that simply cannot be wished away. So if you've ever wondered why debates around the term woke cause so much anger and confusion, this is why. When everyone is using different definitions, there can be no sensible argument at all. Just continual mutual misunderstandings which are apt to spiral out of control. So with that in mind, let's delve a little deeper. What does woke mean? Let's go back to its origins. Its relationship to civil rights goes back to the early 20th century, when the phrase emerged in African American vernacular. It was a metaphor, the idea of waking up to the reality of one's own subjugation. The Jamaican political activist Marcus Garvey, who died in 1940, adopted this metaphor in his famous rallying cry, "Wake up Ethiopia, wake up Africa." Some even date the origins of this usage back to the Wide Awakes, an anti-slavery paramilitary movement formed by supporters of Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party in 1860. So how did we go from the metaphor of waking up to being woke? Well, in Barry Beckham's 1971 play Garvey Lives, the notion of waking up to injustice became modified into the now familiar colloquialism. As one character puts it, "I've been sleeping all my life, and now that Mr. Garvey done woke me up, I'm going to stay woke." The term enjoyed a resurgence in 2008 due to Erykah Badu's song Master Teacher, Stay Woke, and was taken up by the Black Lives Matter movement in 2013. Writers in the media started using the word with glee. It soon became mainstream, and we were inundated with articles such as "Keeping Your Classroom Woke," "Becoming Woke in the Wake of Me Too," and "The Woke Black Person's Guide to Talking About Oppression with Family." In 2016, Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey appeared on stage in a Stay Woke t-shirt. And in 2018, the head of the Comedy Awards at the Edinburgh Fringe, Nika Burns, launched the festival with a speech in which she declared she was, quote, "looking forward to comedy's future in the woke world." So with all these public figures and journalists being woke and proud of it, it's very strange that recently some of these same types of people have tried to claim that the word is just a slur concocted by right-wing reactionaries. Here's Afua Hirsch in The Guardian, for instance. Today, the person using the word is likely to be a right-wing culture warrior, angry at a phenomenon that lives mainly in their imagination. Well, someone ought to tell her colleagues at The Guardian, because they absolutely love the word. We've seen headlines such as, "Can a woke makeover win Barbie and Monopoly new fans?" And "My search for Mr. Woke, a dating diary." And "Why are some Americans woke online, but not in real life?" Maybe the writers at The Guardian are simply a bunch of right-wing culture warriors. Who'd have thought it? So let's recap. The word woke was originally associated with the concept of waking up to injustice and went mainstream sometime in the mid-2010s. At the time, it was used as a form of self-identification by those who have a particular obsession with identity politics and subscribe to the ideology we might call critical social justice or leftist identitarianism. This changed the perception of the word in the public consciousness, because now being woke wasn't just about standing up to racism, which virtually everyone would support. It came with a baggage of a whole other belief system. So these days, when people describe themselves as woke, it's difficult to tell what they mean. On the one hand, they could simply be saying that they are alert to injustice. Great, nothing wrong with that. But for the activists who appropriated the word in the mid-2010s, they are advancing a very specific ideology, one that can be summarised in the following 4 categories. Firstly, censorship. The woke are informed by the postmodernist notion that our understanding of reality is constructed through language. They are convinced that words can be a form of violence, and that censorship, either by the state or social media tech giants or societal pressure, what we call cancel culture, is therefore necessary to guarantee social justice. Secondly, power. The woke maintain that society operates on the basis of invisible power structures that only those who are trained in critical theory are qualified to detect. Denial of such structures is taken as further evidence of their existence, as anyone who would deny them is likely to be benefiting from the privileges they afford. Society, therefore, must be reconstructed in order to guarantee equality of outcome rather than equality of opportunity. In other words, equity rather than equality. Then identity politics. The woke see people in terms of their group identity first and foremost, rather than their individual qualities. Race, gender and sexuality, as opposed to class or economic disparities, are taken to be the determining factors when it comes to mapping the power structures that undergird society. This is why intersectionality plays such a significant role within this ideology. It's also why the woke aren't really left-wing at all, because you can't really be left-wing unless class and economic inequality are your priority. In fact, I would argue that the woke obsession with predominantly middle-class concerns situates them more to the right, but that's a debate for another time. And finally, lived experience. Now, one of the key factors of Enlightenment thinking is the prioritisation of evidence-based epistemology rather than that which is grounded in faith, superstition or intuition. The woke movement, what we might call the counter-Enlightenment, rejects objective truth in favour of a lived experience, what we used to call anecdotal evidence, which presupposes that there are multiple ways of knowing. You'll have heard this idea when people talk about my truth. You'll remember after Meghan Markle's interview with Oprah Winfrey, she was caught out for making statements that were demonstrably false. And Piers Morgan pointed this out on Good Morning Britain, and his colleague Alex Beresford replied, "But that's her lived experience." As though facts don't really matter and perception is everything. All of which accounts for the tendency among the woke to disregard data if they do not corroborate their existing views, and to interpret all forms of inequality of outcome as evidence of systemic oppression. Society, when seen through the woke lens, is interpreted on the basis of group identity. They believe that equity can be achieved through the curtailing of individual freedoms, including freedom of speech. It's based on the belief that Western civilization is wholly underpinned by these systems of oppression, which is why it must be torn down and reconstructed from scratch. That's why every day now we see stories in the news about activists calling for censorship, school and university curricula being decolonised, statues being toppled, streets renamed, and people being punished, sacked or publicly shamed for failing to toe the ideological line. Taken together, these 4 ideas of censorship, power, identity politics and lived experience pretty much sums up what it means to be woke. These are the connotations that we can no longer escape. If we could just pretend that these ideologues hadn't hijacked the term, if we could just go back to when the word simply meant being alert to injustice, then we'd all be woke. But try as we might, we can't undo what's been done. So for all the wrangling over definitions, it might be simpler to think of woke as a synonym for anti-liberal. It's complicated, but we do need some kind of shorthand to encapsulate this regressive, divisive, illiberal and authoritarian movement which has become such a powerful and destructive force in our culture. Woke isn't a perfect word, but it's the best we've got for now. So let's see what the culture warriors have been up to this week. It was would seem that their main target at the moment is the animal kingdom, if you'll forgive the patriarchal terminology. For instance, shark conservationists in Australia have called for a rebrand for shark attacks, suggesting we should refer to them as negative encounters or interactions. Well, we can't accuse them of inaccuracy there. Having your leg chewed off by a ravenous fish certainly does fall into the negative encounter category. And maybe the phrase shark attacks is having a detrimental impact on the shark's self-esteem. I'm not an animal psychologist, I just don't know. And the Entomological Society of America has said they want to rename the gypsy moth and the lesser-known gypsy ant because these terms are offensive. This follows what the Society calls an inclusivity drive to, quote, ensure that insect names are respectful. I'm not sure exactly how many racist attacks have been incited through the medium of moths, but better safe than sorry. Sticking with the animal theme, experts at the UK's biggest cat blogging website, Cats and World, have told pet owners that they should seek their cat's consent before stroking them or picking them up. True, some cats do struggle with English, but as the website says, you can always look out for subtle body language, a twitching of the whiskers perhaps, or a fluttering of the tail. There can be no excuses for non-consensual feline intimacy. Meow means meow. From animals to publishing, the American Booksellers Association has issued an apology for including Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage, in a selection of book samples sent to independent publishers. They claim that the book is anti-trans, which shows that they haven't read it, and they further claim that its inclusion in their sample list was a serious violent incident. I'll say that again. It was a serious violent incident. It's a little disturbing, really, isn't it? A body that specialises in the written word doesn't know the definition of violence. The airline Lufthansa has said it is dropping gender-related terminology from its onboard announcements. So you won't hear any more of those outrageous safety instructions directed to ladies and gentlemen or boys and girls, because that, quite obviously, would be a serious violent incident. And those planes are quite large, so we're talking a lot of passengers here who could be injured through hearing those offensive words. Quite frankly, I would rather the plane went down in flames than anyone on board was misgendered. But don't worry, I'm sure we will achieve our utopian goal of full gender inclusivity thanks to the new emojis that are being rolled out on social media. These now include a range of pregnant men, such as the one you're seeing there. This is long overdue, of course, because I constantly find myself trying to talk about my pregnant male friends over Twitter through pictorial form, and now I can finally do it. This is what progress looks like.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.